and that ends up in a kind of disaster. And do you agree with the kind of orthodoxy that there is a turn in Heidegger's thinking somewhere in the late 30s, early 40s?
Well, yes and no. It depends what's at stake in this notion of a turn. On the one hand, I would say no, insofar as Heidegger's thinking has always been, from the outset to the very end, thinking of the co-belonging of, let's say, Dasein, or the mortal, and being. A thinking of this difference or spacing. On the other hand, there is a definite shift in his thinking in the 30s, and we could even speak more specifically and say around the time of his contributions to philosophy, the Beiträge zur Philosophie. Here, I think what becomes more prominent, more emphatic than before is the role of history in the text that I translated for seminars. Heidegger says that being in time lacked a proper sense of history. In these works of the 30s, Heidegger develops what he calls a being historical thinking. And here, the history of philosophy, of metaphysics, is no longer thought so much as the history of an error or the history of a lie or a force of sedimentation that covers over a truth that has to be exposed again or brought to light. Instead, he sees this covering, if you will, of metaphysics as essential to the question of being itself. In other words, being is no longer thought of without concealment. This isn't the opposite of what he says in Being in Time in any way, but the emphasis changes.
The emphasis changes also away from Dasein as the very center of the focus to, being as such, no? Because he gets away from the existentialist, at least the lexicon of Being in Time.
Right, yeah.
Whereas not necessarily the issue, as you were saying.
There's a certain subjectivism, you could say, of Being in Time that he wants to avoid. The whole apparatus of Being in Time, the structure of the book itself is thoroughly metaphysical, we could say. Heidegger only wrote very few books. What he published were often essay collections, lectures, slightly revised lecture courses. But apart from Being in Time, maybe caught in the problem of metaphysics, there's not much.
That's very interesting about Heidegger, is that even Being in Time, he was forced really to come out with it in order to get tenure, or to get what we would call tenure, to get a post in philosophy, and that a lot of it were based on his lecture notes. And he very rarely did he actually write a book as such. And in that sense, I think he's a very pure philosopher in the Socratic tradition.
Yeah, he's not a thinker of the book.
No,
not a philosopher of the
book. There is some place where he says that Socrates, it's a mystery why all thinkers after Socrates were fugitives into the art of writing, and that Socrates was like the only pure philosopher who philosophized strictly by word of mouth, or in the lecture, or in the room, or the marketplace, agora, and all that. And I think Heidegger had, if he had his druthers, he would never have published a book as such. But nevertheless,
possibly.
Fortunately, we have all those lectures that he.
One other thing that I think needs to be mentioned in regards to this turn in his thinking is that he changes his conception of being. Being, for him, comes to be a matter of withdrawal. And
okay, let's specify before we go on.
Yeah.
The way I understand it, from Being in Time, being comes to mean Dasein's ecstatic projectionality that enables Dasein to come back from the kind of these regions of absentialism and render present things as they are.
Right.
And being is not something that's out there, on its own. It's something that, as you were saying in the opening, it's in radical relation to Dasein. It's Dasein's relationality to things that discloses the realm of being. So how does it differ later?
Well, in a sense, it becomes more radicalized, more finite even, because Dasein's opening onto the world has the risk of sounding like a willful endeavor, as though Dasein were completely in control and that Dasein determined being in some way. And what the transition or the change in Heidegger's thinking is to see that there's also a movement on the part of being that's beyond Dasein's control. So you have these two interrelated, imbricated movements simultaneously. This idea of withdrawal, just briefly put, if you think of being as a whole or as a single sphere in an almost Parmenidean manner, then there would be no differences, no space, no room in that. Withdrawal, in the first moment, makes the world of differences and distances possible by evacuating that area. But the shift that we have to understand is that withdrawal is actually a way that the things exist. They exist in this withdrawn manner, which is to say, they exist partially. They are not whole or discrete or encapsulated things, but everything itself is opened into this space of the world. And that's sort of what Heidegger thinks under the notion of withdrawal, which is an incredibly technical moment or intense moment of this contributions to philosophy.
Yeah, but I think Heideggerians often have a tendency to mystify, the retreat of being, the withdrawal of being. I like the way you put it, that the withdrawal of being is something that is constitutive of things themselves in the world. In other words, there's something about a tree or another person or another where I cannot fully appropriate.
Right.
There is a distance there. There is a certain resistance.
Right.
And an opacity. No?
Right. And that same distance is what allows us to relate to the tree.
Exactly.
The tree to concern us.
It's like Jean-Paul Sartre said, I think in Being and Nothingness, he says that if the chessboard were completely full, you could never have a game. It's only when you take a thing out, you have a hole, now all these things become possible because there's a void there. Right. And likewise, in our relation to things, if there's not a distance, we could never know them as what they are. And being is nothing but knowing things as what they are.
And the point I'm making about withdrawal is that it's not that we take away a few of the pieces and that whole pieces remain. It's that all of the pieces can't be thought of as complete or encapsulated pieces. Right. Withdrawal permeates them.
Exactly, and this is where I think his Origin of the Work of Art, which is a fundamental essay on aesthetics, I think he points out, that's very difficult for people to read, and the language is very technical, but I don't know if I would be over-trivializing to just say that for Heidegger, artworks remind us that things are not radically available totally at our disposal, but that the artwork shows that no matter how much I try to grasp whatever is being painted or the statue, that there's something that draws away from me, and it's the power or the beauty of it is precisely the fact that I cannot hold it in my hands in a tangible way, and there it gives itself on the one hand, but gives itself, as you say, partially, and any artwork that doesn't throw into relief the extent to which things are available to me only in this shrouded, shrouded might be the wrong metaphor, but
most utilitarian manner possible, that everything would be either a tool or a stone. That idea is shattered. Yeah.
And since these discussions go really quickly, Andrew, and we don't have that much time left, why don't we just take this into the question of technology, with which we began at the beginning, at least with my opening remarks.
Certainly.
That if the artwork is something that shows how things have, as you say, this lethic dimension, this withdrawing distance, technology, as Heidegger understands it in his famous essay, The Question Concerning Technology, wants to insist that everything is radically available and disposable to us.
Right.
No?
And Heidegger views this as the culmination of metaphysics. Metaphysics, as the history of philosophy, has constantly misunderstood being, if you could say. It's overlooked this partial character of existence that we've just mentioned and seen complete presence. that becomes hypostasized into...
Now you have to explain to our listeners what that word means. Come on. we're not in the class. Hypostasize.
Well,
it's an old theological term, actually.
Let's say that things become reified into...
That means objectified.
Yeah, objectified into, well, objects that are held to be discrete entities. And that technology is the culmination of this transformation in things into sheer presences.
Right.
Where in technology, everything becomes completely available at our disposal. Heidegger talks about it in terms of ordering and availability, and the internet is the perfect example of this. Everything is available. Everything is at our disposal, and everything is replaceable. If you lose a watch, you can buy the exact same watch.